Thomas Staples' eldest son was John Staples, and John had a son named James, and James had a son named Richard, and Richard had a son named Harold, and Harold had a daughter named Beth, and Beth gave birth to me. The fourth person in that brief lineage is Richard Staples, my great-grandfather, and it's the story of his tragic death while still a young man in his 30s that is our subject here. I've collected 7 or 8 different accounts of the circumstances of Richard's death. Some of those accounts were written just a few days after the terrible event. Others were written years after. Some were written by journalists and then published in Manitoba newspapers. Others were written by family members and close friends and were included in various histories of Manitoba's Swan Valley. Many of the details in all these various accounts are consistent from one to another, but there are some inconsistencies. What follows is my humble attempt to reconstruct the timeline and the details of my great-grandfather's unfortunate demise, having sifted through the data that is available. It was the summer of 1900. And Richard Staples was a new homesteader in the Swan River Valley, having come over just a few months prior from Treherne, which was a distance of over 400 kilometers. At the base of Thunder Hill sat the farm of Will Ford. On the evening of Monday, June 18th, 1900, Will Ford and another man in his employ, a farmhand named Thomas Bell, had been digging a new well. The next morning, Tuesday the 19th, Will had traveled away from his farm to go help another man named Banks. And while Will was away from the farm, Richard Staples paid a visit on some sort of errand. And on arriving at the Ford farm, Richard met up with Thomas Bell. And here's where details in the accounts differ from one another. The accounts that were written by close friends and family members some years after the event seem most plausible to me. That Richard requested that Thomas Bell lower him down the well on a windlass rope so that Richard could help out with the digging at the bottom of the well while he waited for Will Ford to return. The early media accounts, however, report that Richard fell accidentally into the well. However it was that Richard ended up inside that well, which is reported to have been about 35 feet deep at the time, he was overcome with gas, most likely methane gas, and he stopped responding to Mr. Bell, who was still positioned at the top of the well. When Richard stopped replying to Bell, Bell then ran to the house and called on Mrs. Ford in the hope that she would be strong enough to work the windlass while he went down the well to rescue Richard. On the way back to the well, it seems that Mrs. Ford lagged behind a little, and Mr. Bell decided that he wouldn't wait. He would descend down the rope into the well hole. The problem was that the rope fastener broke apart under the strain of Mr. Bell's weight, so that now Mrs. Ford was left up top with no rope to pull Mr. Bell to the surface. With both Richard and Thomas now at the bottom of the well and surrounded with deadly gas fumes, Mrs. Ford ran 4 whole miles to the Banks farm to get help. But by the time she and the helpers returned, both Richard and Thomas had been dead for some time. A third, unidentified man was then sent down the well, presumably on a new rope that had been hastily fastened. But when he reached about 7 or 8 feet down, he signaled to be pulled up, probably very aware of the gas. The corpses of Richard Staples and Thomas Bell were then taken out of the well with grappling irons. The next day, Wednesday, June 20th, 1900, Richard's body was brought into Swan River by his brother, his father-in-law, and my other great-grandfather, Daniel Haw. 38 years later, Daniel Haw reflected back on that fateful day. He wrote, "Sad indeed was the journey to Swan, conveying the remains of Dick, to be forwarded to Treherne for burial, while the remains of Tom was by others interred in a burial plot selected on his homestead." The following day, the Thursday, Richard's father-in-law, Mr. Lee, accompanied the tin-encased, unembalmed body of Richard Staples to Treherne on the Dauphin train to be interred at the Bethel Church Cemetery. Immediately upon arrival in Treherne at 4 a.m., Richard's body was lowered into his grave. Richard's funeral took place in early July and was described in the July 12th issue of the Swan River Star.
Funeral of R.N. Staples. The funeral of the late R.N. Staples, the particulars of whose lamentable death appear in another column, took place on Saturday last to Bethel Cemetery. The funeral procession was one of the largest ever seen in this district, which spoke plainly of the esteem in which he was held by all classes. The service was held in Bethel Church, which was too small to accommodate those who were present to pay the last tribute to the dead. On account of the long distance the body had to be carried, the remains had been lowered into the grave immediately on its arrival at 4 a.m. Treherne Times.
Just 8 days after Richard had died in that well, a wealthy landowner in the Swan Valley named Almon James Cotton, or A.J. Cotton, wrote a letter to his Member of Parliament, J.G. Rutherford.
Dear Sir, I wish to bring before your notice a case deserving your attention. I will explain the matter as simple as possible. It is this. Mr. R.N. Staples, a respected farmer of Treherne district that I've been well acquainted with, in the spring of 1898 took up a homestead in the Swan River Valley, being Northeast 114 Section 28, Township 35, Range 29 West. And on the said homestead he only had 6 months more to obtain his patent, having 60 acres broke and 20 acres under crop, a well-dug house and stable erected, and still has a team breaking, when the following unfortunate circumstances occurred. He called on a neighbor in the valley on the 19th instant and fell into a well, and a second man also lost his life in trying to save Mr. Staples, and a third one had a narrow escape. Now his wife and 3 small children, and another on the way, are mourning a husband and father at Treherne and unable to perform the balance of the homestead duties in the Swan River Valley on account of her condition and circumstances. This may be outside of the regular routine of business, but is deserving of special attention for the sake of the widow and small children. If you can do anything that will assist Mrs. Staples to obtain her patent for this homestead, it will be a case of charity. And the friends of Mr. and Mrs. Staples will be grateful for any assistance you may render on their behalf. Hoping you will do all you possibly can in this deserving case. I remain yours truly, A.J. Cotton.
I'm not sure what the exact outcome of Cotton's letter was for Eliza Jane Staples, my great-grandmother, and her 3 small children, with one on the way. My hope is that Mr. Rutherford was sympathetic and generous toward her.